Welcome. We are live. Welcome to another live stream. You know, Sunday night live stream, just chilling, talking to the chat, hanging out. Gonna update you guys on, what's been going on the front lines. Let's get the chat pumped out here, and we will discuss. It's certainly been in some ways a busy week in terms of changes on the front line. In some ways, not really that busy at all. So, okay, I see that we're live, but it doesn't really say anything about the concurrence. I can't really. YouTube's just being YouTube, not really giving me any data at all on my viewers, which is cool. But I can see you guys in the chat. As always, guys, you guys know the rules. If you want your question answered, you want to jump to the front of the line, so to speak, you can always throw me a super chat. We're doing good. Beyond that, yeah, people out here shouting out Strike Gum. I appreciate it. Yeah, we're working on getting Strike Gum into stores, which would be absolutely awesome. That way you guys don't have to pay for shipping, and we can reach a whole new audience. People are like, stop shaving your beard. Listen, man, that beard is so thick. Like, the hair is just so coarse that, like, food gets caught in it. It drives me crazy. I can only take it for so long before I have to trim it down. That is just my reality. I mean, you see, look at how thick my eyebrows are. Now imagine how thick the beard is, right? That's the situation we're dealing with here. So, you guys want to talk about what the last week has brought? All right, let's crack into it. And again, if you guys have questions, man, just let me know. Just let me know. So I think the biggest interesting part is, guys, 2 weeks ago, the fighting was heaviest in Donetsk and New York. And you guys know that we raised a ton of money for the guys fighting down there. And apparently the Russians got their asses kicked. So as you can see, as we work our way back, yeah, there's been some progress, but man, it has been glacially slow, right, as we work it back. So here's kind of the start of here's like, let's say back to the start of the month, right? So you can see right here is about the 2nd of July. So you can see the Russians make this pretty big advance near Yurivka, and then over the course of the next month, they make these little tiny infinitesimally small expansions. You can see them kind of pushing out. They might be trying to pressure these Ukrainians on the side, but their strategy seemed to be to push into Donetsk from 2 directions. And you can see here that basically they reached Yurivka pretty quickly. And then from there, the apex of their advance was 1.71 kilometers. So not exactly a super effective strategy here. Strategy you didn't know. Thanks for the $2 Canadian. That's like $400 million US, right? Why is smoke not used or not effective? So that's a good point. Early in the war, we saw smoke being used quite frequently. My thesis is that smoke isn't used because of 2 different perspectives for 2 different reasons, right? If you're doing light infantry combat, i.e. trench clearing, what's going to happen if you pop smoke in a trench? Well, you're going to blind the enemy, sure, but you're going to blind yourself too, unless you have something that lets you see through the smoke, like thermal, like really high-end thermal sights or thermal goggles. You and the enemy are going to be equally blind. The difference is if you are the attacker, you don't know that trench that well. But then again, the enemy may not either. So you don't want to just blind everybody, right? If you're doing that force-on-force, close-range, trench clearing, bunker clearing combat. And then if you're doing more open area armored combat, right? That's a discussion that often gets had is, why don't these Russian armored columns deploy smoke? And the reason for that is actually in all likelihood because of drones. because if you have drone observation overhead, that's what's walking in artillery fire. That, obviously FPV drones are coming in from above. And so when you deploy smoke, right, you don't want to deploy smoke on your own position and blind yourself. You're gonna deploy forward of your position between you and the enemy to block their line of sight. But if the enemy's line of sight is primarily 400 feet in the air, then what good is smoke going to do, right? All it's going to do is make your position more obvious. So that's my thesis with why we've seen so little smoke. Another question, does the AFU mine the front as much as Russia? In some ways, from what I've heard, so the difference is like Western countries, because they've signed the treaty against landmines, don't have as many like passive landmines in their arsenal, so there's not as many to give. And the mines they do give have kind of expiration dates. So that is why I think that's why you that's why you see Ukraine, like sometimes you're like, oh, they mine as much, but here's the thing, the Russians behave as though they're mining extensively. So that's the thing, right? The Russians behave as though there's extensive mining, so I think there is. Okay, so where else has the front line been advancing, right, in the last couple of weeks? If we take it back on the old calendar to the 1st, right, you can see that the largest advances that we've seen have been around here, right? And this is in the last month. You can see that Russian forces over the course of the month have actually made some pretty stark advances, particularly from Ultradatina. So on the 1st, you can see they were in Yevhenivka. And over the course of this month, that's like the furthest advance we've seen them make. They've actually pushed almost 7 kilometers. All right. So a really surprising advance. Again, 7 kilometers in a month is not fast by most military standards, but in this war, it's a lightning advance. And, as we pointed out, Ukraine does have a hard time. It has been having a hard time stopping this advance. Again, it's debatable. Ukrainians would likely say, hey, we don't actually want to. Or rather, it's not that important to us. Syrskyi has said we don't defend ruins to the death. That's been a core part of his policy. Has said, hey, we defend in depth. We inflict a lot of casualties. And the fact is that they probably are looking at some of these towns and are just zoomed out a little bit and say, listen, it's not unbelievably essential that we hold this area. I don't know what that calculus would be, why they would accept Russian advances here and not elsewhere. I think this is just where Russia's trying its best to advance, and Ukraine is likely just saying, sure, buddy. Like, we're going to butcher your guys as much as we possibly can. But again, 7 kilometers in a month, that's a non-trivial advance. And there's rumors, again, that Russian forces have indeed taken Proharis, Volchi, that they're now moving towards Vasily. And you can see this has been over the last couple of days. It's been a pretty big advance. You can see that this is just the last week. And they've covered, probably 6 of those 6.5 kilometers in the last, looks like I'd say about 7 days. So is this part of a critical situation for Ukraine? It's also possible that Ukraine is saying, listen, as Syrskyi has said, hey, we don't defend bad terrain. They may be sitting there and saying, listen, if we lose Prohes and Volchi, we're just going to be defending a different defensive line. A totally separate one. So again, and the reason is because the narrative around it has, like, the narrative around Donetsk was actually pretty bad. The narrative around Kharkiv was also pretty, like, grave, you know, but the narrative around this just hasn't been quite the same. And that makes me think that this is part of more about a repositioning or a strategic, like more of a strategic repositioning than a real indication of like a really, really like degraded Ukrainian tactical situation. That's my thesis. Again, I don't have substantial evidence either way. All right, there's pretty good evidence that the Russians are taking a lot of casualties, and obviously there's considerable evidence that they're making advances. Why this area in particular? Again, it seems to be the Russians' focus, and like they are advancing, right? The Ukrainians are yielding positions, the Russians are gaining it. But again, it's not clear that it is that this is entirely like a rout against the Ukrainians, and that it's not just a repositioning into newer, improved defensive lines. Which I wonder if we could try to draw some inferences here, though it's a little tough in kind of this without a terrain map. Let me see if I can pull. Let me see if I can get the deep state to show me a terrain map, like an actual elevation terrain map. Maybe in settings, topo map. Can you give me a good topo map? Does it think I'm looking at a topo map? There's a satellite. Oh, that's your topographic map? My brother in Christ, you need... Let's turn off the dark theme. Maybe that'll make it better. Oh, okay, that helps a little. Yeah, so let's see. I mean, you're right. This is very like low ground here, it appears. And it looks like, again, there might have been this river defending Volchi and Proheris that could have formed a natural barrier that once the Russians kind of penetrated it, the Ukrainians may have said, listen, we gotta rethink this. We gotta reevaluate where we're trying to hold. So they may sit there and say, listen, there's kind of some water obstacles here that we could use to form a new defensive line, maybe these tree lines. This seems like kind of open ground, and it's hard to dig in open ground, right? It kind of cuts both ways. Yeah, and please be sure to hit the like button if you just made it in, guys. Obviously, it helps. It tells YouTube algorithm that this is a fun live stream, that we're really covering some good stuff. Yeah, and it may be a case where the Ukrainians sit there and go, listen, this is just a lot of open terrain. We're just going to fight on our back foot. They may sit there and say, listen, we're going to try to hold maybe this area here as our primary defensive point. Make the Russians really fight to take Hodivka. You know, they could use this whole defensive line as their next spot. I mean, that's a lot of turf to surrender, but it could be the plan. They could sit there and be like, that's what we're just going to use this whole thing as a kill box against Russians. It's possible. It's a lot of turf. But again, the Ukrainians have shown, listen, our priority is keeping our people safe and alive, and crushing a lot of Russians, so that when we do go to negotiate when we get to the negotiating table, Russia is under a lot of political pressure because of the casualties. And I think in listening to a lot of the political statements by the Ukrainian leadership, that sounds like kind of the new perspective, so to speak, of their strategy, right? So they're combining a little bit of an asymmetric warfare strategy with a kind of war of attrition strategy, where they're saying, listen, the Taliban beat the United States. They're in Kabul, we're not. And they didn't beat them because they killed more American soldiers, right? In fact, there was nowhere in the country that American soldiers couldn't go if they so chose to. The problem became the logistics and the public support. Ultimately, it was very expensive, and the public didn't give a shit about it, and nobody thought we were actually achieving our objectives. And ultimately, finally, the White House was like, we just got to get out of here, dudes, right? And so they did. They were just like, yeah, sure, whatever, when we left. It was kind of an embarrassing loss for the United States, but here's the thing. It had been an embarrassing loss since day one. But the Taliban strategy was to just force the United States to outspend tremendously. And it happened. They worked. The U.S. spent $2 trillion to make sure that Afghanistan was ruled by the Taliban, to return to the status quo ante. And so the Ukrainians are pursuing, I think, a similar strategy where their number one target is not necessarily the Russians on the battlefield or stopping Russian battlefield success. It may be focused on putting political pressure on Putin from many sides. Obviously, from his diplomatic sides, where they have his trade partners and key industrial countries are sanctioning him. So he has fewer places he can export and import from. He still has China, which is a huge problem. And then they're saying, okay, and we also want to squeeze him from below by incurring so many casualties and forcing the war to become this massive burden on the average Russian. This is how the Soviets lost in Afghanistan. It wasn't because they took an unbelievable number of casualties, right? 16,000 casualties. That's what, 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks of fighting here. And in 10 years of war, right? The Soviets in Afghanistan took 16,000 casualties. But because that war was so expensive and so pointless and so enraging to the average general public that it damaged the credibility of the Soviet state permanently. And that, I think, is Ukraine's strategy at this point, to say, listen, we're going to damage the credibility of the Russian state permanently. We're going to hurt so many Russian families that they'll have no choice but to boot Putin out, right? And that's, obviously that's killing Russians, but it's also cooking them economically. It's forcing Russia, to raise interest rates, to collect more taxes, to fund their war machine, to divert more of their country's resources away from social spending and more towards the war. And like that sort of behavior, right? That sort of environment of steadily pushing the Russian public. Because clearly Putin has indicated since day one of this war that he really worries about a general outcry from the public. Because that's why he didn't enact a second mobilization. That's why there was no draft. That's why all of this has been kind of isolated away from at least the Russian public. And so I think that is likely the strategy that Ukraine's pursuing, is just to get the Russian public so mad that that Putin himself begins to say, listen, I gotta get out of here, Right. This special military operation has been going on for nearly 3 years. 2.5 years of this. And like for Ukraine, it's an existential fight for survival. Ukrainians, in polling data, overwhelmingly support their military. They support fighting Russia. Ukrainians overwhelmingly are in favor of keeping their territorial integrity. And Ukraine has an advantage of a steady flow of resources from EU and Western countries. Russia doesn't necessarily have that, right? China's willing to do business with them, but again, having the right to purchase weapons is not the same thing as receiving huge numbers of gifted weapons. So that, I think, is a core part of this new Ukrainian strategy that they're pursuing. Anyway, guys, I want to take a quick shout out to Strike Gum. I know a bunch of you guys were talking about it in chat. I appreciate all you guys that have picked some up. You guys know that if you've been to a gas station, these energy drinks are like $5 a pop, like actually. And Strike Gum is just the superior alternative. 90 milligrams of caffeine in every single piece, right? That's as much as a Red Bull in every stinking piece. So if you haven't picked some up, man, you're crazy not to. We're out here saving money. So, check it out, strikegum.com, or you can go to Amazon. Just search for Strike Gum. It's too easy. And I appreciate all you guys who have left us those reviews on Amazon. Man, that is so helpful. Okay. Do you believe we are in an overshoot phase? Thanks for the super chat strategy. An overshoot phase in terms of food to world population. Well, here's the thing. In like the 1850s to 1880s, people started looking, they started to have some like statistics, right? And they said, hey, the world population is growing very quickly. It's growing exponentially. And our ability to make food is growing like geometrically. Geometrically? It's growing like conventionally, right? So every year we're adding, I don't know, I'm making these numbers up. Like 1 million tons of arable farmland is being farmed. And they said, but population growing exponentially. So people thought, man, the end state of these two trends is going to be that the world is going to reach a level of population in which every person is basically existing at like subsistence. And they were like, oh, it's so bad. And then something weird happened. The Industrial Revolution. And then kind of the Information Revolution. And as it got into more and more places, more and more people started to realize, hey, listen, having as many kids as humanly possible doesn't actually work. It's not an optimal survival strategy, right? Bottom line. And so people started to have smaller and smaller families. And when that happens in every industrialized country, right, when it reaches a certain level of industrialization, family size and family size or the fertility rate starts to actually level out and then begins to fall. And so right now, globally, it's leveling off. And so at the same time, you're actually seeing a huge revolution. Like at first in the 1850s, again, people were like, okay, the way to get more food is to farm more land, period. But now, and again, with the Industrial Revolution, it turned out you could make land more productive. And so you have these two trends that have inverted what people thought was going to be an absolute catastrophe, where the global population growth is slowing. It's still growing, but it's growing at a more manageable rate and will for about the next 75 years. And the ability to produce food is increasing, right? Farmland is getting more productive. So in conclusion, no, I don't think this is like a one-off. Cool Clear Water is a troll comment. Okay, Ukraine likely not unbelievably corrupt. And for example, you would know Ukraine, you would be able to identify a corrupt country by certain characteristics. For example, would be staged or fake elections. Another one might be control of major industries by inside political players, like a sort of cadre of oligarchs. Another example of a corrupt country would be conducting assassinations of dissidents, or maybe imprisoning them in faraway, prison colonies far away from the country's capital. Of course, you would also see, a military that was, despite being very large, might be actually gutted because so many of their leaders were reselling or siphoning resources, meaning that even if that military tried to take on a much smaller country, it wouldn't be able to do so because, again, the corrupt shithole country would have gutted their military. And so instead it would be you know, evenly matched or even in many ways beaten by an almost comically smaller military. So by that metric, we can be pretty confident that Ukraine isn't at least systemically severely corrupt. Now, every country has corruption. Listen, I'm an American. You're not going to trick me that there's a corruption-free country. But when we look at the big picture, there are some countries in the globe that are much higher in terms of a corruption index, we'll say. Leadfoot asks, is it realistic that Ukraine could keep stepping back and then when the Russians are exhausted, push back hard? Yeah, that's a strategy that I actually thought the Ukrainians should have done in their counteroffensive. Because instead of, so you might recall that the Wagner group was pushing hard into Bakhmut. And what they weren't doing was building defensive positions. They were on offense. And that can actually be an asset when your enemy is on offense. By definition, they're not preparing for the defense. And so it's possible, probably not in this conflict, but it can be possible that if you launch an unexpected counterattack as the enemy's offensive is losing steam, as their troops are losing ability, you launching a decisive counterattack can actually stage a fairly robust breakthrough. Now, that said, the problem with this conflict is that because of the excellent reconnaissance from satellites down to drones, it's hard to assemble a large counterattacking force unexpectedly. And so what tends to happen is if the Russians were to observe that an area, again, let's say the Ukrainians were said, hey, we're gonna stage a big counterattack in Donetsk, right? Then what you would likely, what the Russians would likely observe is large gatherings of troops in places like, I don't know, Horodivka. And they'd say, stop the advance. We have to start digging in because the Ukrainians are preparing for an attack. Or we can't continue advancing because the Ukrainians literally, there's 2 extra brigades sitting here. So I think it's possible, but it involves some challenges that neither side has really yet solved. And also, why can't Ukraine jam the GPS of fab bombs like Russia does? If Ukraine had that capability, they likely wouldn't make it public. The Russian GPS jamming, also so Russia has its own sort of less good GPS alternative, and so Russia can jam the GPS satellites because it has its own shittier version. Ukraine may be able to jam that. It may be more complicated. I'm not really sure. Again, and it's highly possible that Ukraine does it. Ukraine may also just be prioritizing other jamming tech. I think that's possible. Again, when you tell me about Russia rolling out some big bad gee-whiz weapon, I'm always a little skeptical. I'm sure their fab bombs are really bad. I'm sure they're really powerful. And I'm sure Russia can't manufacture them at scale. So I suspect that the Ukrainians may be looking and saying, listen, what kind of jamming device do we need to manufacture? Probably something that jams FPV drones, because that is what Russia has in spades. So, what other questions do you guys have? And Puka, thanks for addressing the chat comments. Takes the poise to deal with this absolute cluster. I am, listen, the trolls, as one, I just ignore them, and they're adding to my total viewer count. So, as long as the trolls watch the ads, we're good. But I appreciate you becoming the 3-month member, man. Thanks. Okay, there's a lot of conversation about Mali. I'm actually gonna save that for tomorrow's video. I want a little more details to emerge. There's a couple of things I want to try to run down, especially the rumors about Ukrainian special forces actually being in Mali and supporting the rebels who are taking on Wagner. Okay, one of the chat questions: how much longer can this war last? 1 year, 5 years? Well, that's sort of the other big question that everyone has. When you have a war of attrition, and both sides are pretty dug in, right? They're pretty leaned out, right? So the Ukrainians, for example, are receiving billions of dollars a year from the interest on seized Russian assets. And so just like a dividend stock, those checks are going to come indefinitely, right? They're unlikely to run out. And so you also have a lot of European countries that have signed 5 or 10-year commitments to Ukraine to steadily provide them with support. And so and then on the other side, of course, you have Russia, who's really institutionalized its mobilization policies, really institutionalized its agreements with China, streamlined its ability to purchase Chinese gear and sell them low-priced goods. And so you have both of these sides that really feel dug in. But the sad fact is that, yeah, this war probably has definitely at least 12 months in it, since both sides are really far apart on negotiations. And remember, we in the West, or at least Western media, or the popular zeitgeist, that's a better term. Popular zeitgeist is like, oh, war in Europe started in 2022. Not true. Russian-backed separatists had been operating, and by Russian-backed, I mean literally Russian military soldiers removing their patches. Were fighting in the Donbass and largely the Donbass, but also had annexed Ukraine illegally in 2014. So we're talking about Ukraine was already 8 years into this war. Now, it had been at a much lower level, and this really turned what was a simmering conflict, turned it real hot. So for the Ukrainians to sit there and be like, oh, it's going to be another 8 years. I mean, this is a lot, but it is not unrealistic, or it's not impossible, because literally they've already done it for an initial 8. Rod, thank you for the super chat. Says Ukraine needs to declare the Black Sea a no-go zone. Bro, if you're the Russian Black Sea Fleet, it basically is. The Russian Black Sea Fleet been attrited a lot. Again, the fact that it got just butchered by Ukrainian drones, I think and hope that every single Blue Water Navy, basically the United States, I hope they are losing a lot of sleep over it, right? The Pentagon should be, excuse me, because the U.S. military and our naval forces are so legacy. Functionally, in terms of structure, to me, they look like World War II. World War II also was centered on the Carrier Strike Group. It has been a naval conflict since. And so a lot of navies probably need to wake up and be like, yo, yeah, Russia's Navy is a little dated, didn't quite have some of the tech, but that's a long, but it still got absolutely tore to pieces by a remote-controlled jet ski with some C4 strapped to it. So that should cause people to lose some sleep. Okay, question. Why do Ukrainians focus on the bridge when most supplies go to Crimea through the ground connection to Zaporizhzhia? I don't think that's true. I still think Ukraine funnels most of its supplies through this connection. Or excuse me, Russia funnels most of its supplies through this connection. The primary reason, though, is because Ukraine, with existing weapon systems, can conduct a lot of interdiction of anything that passes through here. And then, right, you also have the fact that longer, okay, so with logistics also involves traffic jams, right? There's not that many really passable roads here, right, that can handle the volume of traffic. And the stuff that has to pass through here has to go to the Russian forces fighting. So you can't sit there and be like, all right, you're going to run stuff in here. Some of it's going to go to the Russian forces fighting all the way up and through here. But remember, Russian aviation and their logistics depots all the way down here. This is a very, very important Russian logistics hub. And if it can't, like for their aircraft, for a lot of their air defenses, for a lot of this is one of the only areas in contested Ukraine that are outside of some Ukrainian, like HIMARS and ATACMS and other kind of deep strike weapons. So again, for the Russians, they have to get their supplies to they have to supply this peninsula somehow, and they have to have somewhere where they can be relatively safe, and then get the supplies kind of diffused through the front line. And yeah, of course, it's unlikely that these troops are almost certainly supplied from Russian routes. But again, it's also the vulnerability. This is a really, really vulnerable point, whereas there's not really a comparably vulnerable thing in any of these other routes. Okay. Oh, Rod says supply ships going to Russia also fully dead zone. So I think, as we've talked about, the sanctions likely are limiting, not eliminating, but limiting the amount of trade Russia does with Europe, and that large portions of their trade are likely also occurring through China, through rail. So that's kind of what I suspect. Understand that, again, there is a lot of stuff that comes into the Crimean Peninsula, as we point out. So, again, stuff has to go from the Crimean Peninsula over and back in. It's tough to say if that would be worthwhile. They may also, for the same reason that so many countries are mad at the Houthis for bombing civilian ships, there's likely just sort of an international agreement that says, listen, you can't take out supply ships. You can't sink them in critical straits because it's going to choke off trade to lots of other countries. Sledgehog says, what's the recent discussion about Russia threatening Finland? Sounds completely mental to me. UA is too much trouble for RU right now. Yeah, I suspect. I haven't seen the exact quote you're talking about, but you have to think that Russia feels it needs to continue to deter other countries around it. Remember, it views Finland and Sweden as part of NATO and an imminent threat to Russian sovereignty. Or at least they consider them rivals who need to be deterred. And if the Russian military, the conventional military, can't fulfill that deterrent mission, you have to rely on other types of deterrence. And so they have to go a little bit with the North Korea strategy, right? North Korea is small, it's impoverished, it's surrounded by what it considers enemies, except for China. And so its strategy is is to say, okay, well, I don't have that much of a military compared to like the South, but I'm crazy. So making these kind of threats and being really bellicose and keeping your enemy on your toes is a sort of deterrent. It's like a dog growling, right? If the weaker the dog gets, the more it growls, is the best way to think of kind of how Russia and how any country really is viewing this. Okay, from the outside looking in. Thanks for the $27 Canadian. What do you believe Ukraine's next counteroffensive will be, and where do you believe it would be most efficient? Love the work. Keep up the great work. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. It's tough to say, honestly. It's tough to say where Ukraine's counteroffensive will be. Ukraine likely, yeah, it's really tough for me to say. Because, again, what they're not going to do is push into Zaporizhzhia. They may choose to try to just unravel some of this Russian fighting in Donetsk. They may simply rely on more localized counterattacks, right? I think they may focus as they get more troops stood up, they get more brigades, they get more resources. They may actually use those to do things like rotate their troops, conduct troop rotations. They may try to step up each of their brigades to make them better able to just buzzsaw Russians and to slow the Russian advance. I think that's likely what they'll do because, again, the Ukrainians want Russia. The Ukrainians need to be in this for the long term for their own sake. And that means not having soldiers have to fight indefinitely, right? Having some kind of rotation system. And that means, of course, figuring out a way to fight that is less attritional for them and prevents Russians from staging any really substantive, meaningful breakthroughs. Ohms, thank you for the 5 and for the strike gum. Get some shout out. You know I'm here for it. Thanks to everybody that's picked up some strike gum. I can't chew some now because it's 8 p.m. here and I will never sleep again. And my wife would be very mad if I was up all night. I don't even know what I would do. To play Fortnite, I guess? I don't know. Jackson ESG says for the 5 or the 6 euro says, okay, in questionable spelling. Fun fact, in the beginning, I thought you were working with the CIA to influence positive support and education of the war. Yeah, so the CIA, fun fact, prohibited from doing that domestically. Also, I wouldn't be I don't want to say I wouldn't feel the need to launch my own gum if I was working for the CIA. I actually wouldn't be able to. It just wouldn't work. Also, I would be way richer if I was working for the CIA. I would definitely demand a lot more money. Yeah, I would. I don't know what I would do with it all, but I would definitely take taxpayer money. I am not ashamed, right? You know, they paid me. The U.S. taxpayer paid me about, I think, $50,000 for my year in Afghanistan. So I feel like I'm entitled to just a smidge more. You know, risking my life. Yeah, yeah. But nope. Unfortunately, no. This is, and here's the thing. Honestly, like kidding aside, I wouldn't work for the government because one, they're idiots, and I say this as someone who spent 7 years in the federal government. They're so clunky, they're so dumb, and their ability to do like media outreach, public affairs, they're all absolutely garbage at their job. And the fact is that also I get to wake up and say whatever I want, right? And if anyone ever tells you, oh, Paul's a shill, just remember that no one in the U.S. government that's employed by them can like use their official position to encourage people to take a political stance. So when we did that big write-in campaign for to get Congress to pass the Ukraine aid bill, that would have been a massive no-no if I was actually employed by the U.S. federal government. I would be in so much trouble. I'd be replaced by someone else in a heartbeat. Agent B7, thank you for the 5. Just want to say thanks for everything you do. And somehow in some NAFO communities, people consider you a content farm. It's a shame. I make a lot of content, and I appreciate. I consider that some form of compliment. People just cannot believe that I put out a superhuman amount of videos and analysis. But it's a war, dudes. It's like people saying, I can't believe CNN and Fox News have a news story every day. You mean to tell me something new happens every day? I'm like, yeah, it's a big world out there. But you know what? That's okay. I don't make content for everybody. And NAFO is the NAFO guys. You know what? They do good work. They're out there raising a ton of money for the Ukrainians, and so are we. So you know, no hate, no shade, right? Somebody asked, did NATO ever reach out to you like Preston Stewart? No. No, the closest I got, I have a friend from grad school who worked for a think tank, and he texted me and was like, "Hey, I can totally get a couple of like pretty prominent retired generals to come on and talk about stuff." But this is somebody I've known for 7 or 8 years, so long before I worked for the feds, and he actually, I don't think is even a U.S. citizen. I think he is a green card holder. So I don't think he's definitely not out there. Definitely not out there working for anybody other than himself. So NAFO is a charity wing that's run, I think it's primarily Jake Bro. It's a nonprofit sending goods to Ukrainians. Yeah. Okay. Actually, guys, so I hear my wife. She has done dinner, and she has graciously waited until 8:45 to hold off on eating. So it is now after 8:45. So I got to get out of here. Huge thank you to all you guys that are shouting out the gum in the channel. That's the kind of brigading that I can get into. And I appreciate really you guys coming out, hanging out with me. You know, put a like up there. Mark of reality: if the price drops of oil to like $20 a barrel, how long is the Russia war machine going to last? That is a question best left to an analyst who is more capable than me. I really don't know because sometimes countries will sign these long-term purchase agreements and Monkey Mode says your jawline seems sharp. Have you been mewing? No, it's just because I trimmed the beard and like, you know, I think sometimes the beard really gives my jaw that angular look. I've also been on a cut, like a not like a big crazy cut, but I've been like the summer cut, so that's probably why. Anyway, guys, I really appreciate you. I'm gonna get out of here and get some dinner, and I will see you guys in the next one. Cheers.